everybody. Welcome back to this Microsoft Virtual Academy Jumpstart on the modern web platform. Still here with Michael Palermo. We're going to be here all day. And we just covered a lot of good information that was a quick on-ramp to the web platform, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. I think we should tell everybody about styling and layout, as promised.
I agree. This is very important. I love that we're going to have a focus just on this aspect of CSS.
Yeah. It's a bit of a deep dive into CSS. So Michael covered some of these topics, but I'm going to be a bit more in depth on them. But again, it's not just standard training curriculum here. This is an overview and a feature hit of the modern web platform. So we're jumping through and hitting some of the good topics. Now, my first bullet point here is gray because it's not really on topic, but I thought I'd take this opportunity to tell you about the IE Dev Center because it's really helpful for me. In fact, I made a short link for this, so I'll show you that now. So I'm going to jump out to a browser, and I'm going to take you to aka.ms/IE Dev Center, okay? Because the URLs, you know, they're long. This one's short. Hopefully you can remember IE Dev Center. So aka.ms IE Dev Center, and it takes you to this page that I think this is extremely helpful because this is a good portal. It's a good starting page for getting into the documentation and a whole bunch of other features all around the web platform. If you're into the web platform, this is a really good place to go. There are a number of really good sites for learning HTML5, for testing compatibility, all kinds of stuff. This is a really good one to start with because it's a really good overview. So I'll just show you a couple of the things that you can do. One of the big heroes here is that you can scan a web page for common coding problems, and this is super helpful. I'm going to actually put in my own URL here, codefoster.com. We'll see. I'm probably going to have some errors in my website. Actually, I go here quite a bit, and I check each of these, and I do have some issues, some of which are on the back burner. I've got to fix them someday, but they're not necessarily problems. They're just, features that I haven't implemented yet. So this is going to check a number of the things that you should really have implemented on your website. Let's take, for example, the IE11 tiles and notifications that you see right here. The tiles and notifications is a feature that you can add to, let me jump back here, that you can add to your website that makes it act like an app in Windows 8. All you really have to do is sprinkle a couple of meta tags at the beginning of your main HTML file, and all of a sudden it works like an app in that you can pin it to the start screen, and that tile on your start screen can be updated with notifications. So for instance, I could let people pin codefoster.com to their start screen, and then they would get my blog post feed on the tile on their start screen. So that's pretty great, and it's really easy to do. As a matter of fact, from here, let me go back to the start page here. If you go down to the bottom, there's a tool on the Dev Center called My Pinned Site, and I haven't gone back here. And there's a tool called My Pinned Site, Build My Pinned Site, and you just simply go here and you fill out some information, and it gives you the code. It gives you these meta tags that you need to just go paste into your site, and bam, you've got yourself a tile. So that's super helpful.
That's cool.
Love that. There's also this thing called modern.ie. Modern.ie allows you to test your website from various devices, various screen sizes. It uses, and in fact, you get 3 free months of this browser stack that's quite popular. Maybe you've heard of it. It'll give you screenshots from all these various browsers. It'll even let you run your website in virtual machines that are running, who knows, XP with IE8, what does your site look like? Who knows?
Right.
Let's go check it out with modern.ie. So you've got the entire MSDN library, and there's also a link to the MSDN library is really exhaustive. There's lots of information in there. But if you go to this web platform docs, this is kind of neat. This is a collaboration of a number of different big companies at webplatform.org, all documenting the web platform and in a kind of a more modern fashion. So that's really slick for going and looking up, what CSS properties can I apply to this div? What's that going to do to it? And so on. The last thing that I want to point out here is this IE Test Drive. This is super awesome. IE Test Drive is a collection of demos, kind of like Code Show, except these are all centered around the web platform. Not necessarily Windows apps using HTML and JavaScript, but just around the web platform. And you can run this from IE, you can run this from Chrome, you can run it from Firefox, whatever you want. The one that I really like is this browser surface that shows off the touch capability in the browser. So running in a public website here, I'm able to fully capture the multiple touch points from the user. So what this demo has done is it's loaded all of these images, and I can filter them by touching these little filter buttons here. And then I can grab these images and I can pull them out onto the screen. This is using touch. Now, it's not just using kind of a translation of a touch point to a mouse click, because if that was the case, it wouldn't be able to recognize that.
Whoa.
That's a multi-touch. That's a gesture, if you will.
Yeah.
And so I'm able to really get fancy with these images, make them large. Watch this. I'm going to try to use one hand, 2 fingers on one hand to control that one, and 2 fingers on the other hand to control that one. This is happening on the web. This is pretty slick.
Yeah.
This is fun. And you can bring more of these out, and depending on your hardware support, you can really go crazy with multi-point touch. You can get kind of as many fingers as you've got on the screen and have some fun with it. So you get a lot of really cool demos in here. I'm going to show a couple of things in here throughout the day, but there are a lot of cool demos. It's worth a browse to see what it offers for you. So that's the IE Dev Center. Should be really helpful as a good, strong reference for you. Next, we're going to dive into basic CSS syntax. And I say basic, but actually, there are a lot of things in CSS syntax that I feel like people miss. They use the basics. They do what Michael showed you. They address elements using its ID or using a class, but they miss some of the other features of it that really make it powerful. So we're going to look at CSS syntax here. And for the syntax, we're going to look at the basic anatomy of a style rule. And then we're going to cover these concepts: selectors, combinators, directives, properties. And if you really want to dive into this, I'll do another little shameless plug here. You can go to codefoster.com/CSS book. And I mention a book that I wrote last year, and this is for Windows 8, but actually it ends up kind of, a lot of it's just CSS, so most of it still applies. And in here I kind of talk about all of these concepts. But we're going to look at selectors, combinators, directives, and properties, and this will show you how you can use CSS to really be powerful. If you're just using the ID and the type ID and class selectors, you're doing the basics, but you really want to go a little bit deeper. These selectors are part of what's called a style rule. And CSS is based on style rules. CSS in your app or in your site is just a collection of a whole bunch of style rules, okay? And each of those style rules may be made up of multiple simple selectors. So you'll see in a lot of your style rules that there are a number of terms, often separated by spaces, but there are other things that you can separate them with. So what you're looking at now is a style rule that has a selector. That's the first line here. This is the selector, and that selector is made up of 2 simple selectors, this one and this one. And those 2 simple selectors have a combinator in between. It doesn't look like a combinator. It looks a whole lot like a space to me. A space is a combinator. That's the first and most basic combinator. And what it means is look for this element, or elements, because this is a class, so it could apply to multiple elements, but look for any element that matches this, that has a class of when settings flyout, and then look for any children that it might have that matches this simple selector, has a class of when back button, okay? And once you've found all the elements that match that combination, then I want you to apply these style properties to it, okay? So the style selector is the what do you want to apply it to, and then the properties are what is it that you want to do to that style rule.
So in that example that you had, would it just pull all of those elements, or would it just pull the children? What would actually be
It would actually be pulling the thing on the far right.
On the far right.
All of the simple selectors, if we had multiples of these, if we had multiple simple selectors, and then we end with this one, then this is what ends up getting selected, and that's what your style properties are going to apply to. So I'm really glad you brought that question.
So that first selector is more like a criteria to get to the other one.
Yep,
okay.
Exactly. Okay, so let's look at these selectors. The selectors, like Michael mentioned, can be a type selector. Before type selector, and a lot of people miss this, before type selector, there's another one called the universal type selector. Have you ever seen that?
I have.
The universal type selector is an asterisk, and you hardly ever see it in CSS because it's implied. If you don't use it, it's there. And if you just refer to a class like with .myClass, remember Michael's example was .many. If you just refer to .many, you are referring to asterisk .many. It's implied right there, okay? But it's important to know that, and actually sometimes it's helpful just to use it because you want to say, I want to find all elements under a certain element or whatever. Okay, so know about the universal type selector, even though you'll rarely use it.
Gotcha.
You'll rarely type it. You'll use it always, but you'll rarely type it.
Exactly.
Speaking of type, so the type selector, like Michael mentioned, allows you to say things like div, and it will match all divs on the screen. Span, P, video, audio, whatever kind of element that you're trying to target, you can use that type selector. Class uses a dot, and that targets elements that have a class that matches whatever you put after your dot. So you can see that the class is in use here where we're saying, I'm looking for an element. Note, remember, there's an asterisk that's implied right there. I'm looking for an element of any type that has a class of win-settings flyout. Okay?
So that would mean in the element, I would actually see class equals that word minus the dot.
Yep. And keep in mind that classes, like you said, can be applied to a number of elements. And also, within an element, it can have many classes applied to it. So we just said class equals many. But you could say class equals many, space active, space hover, space whatever you want. You could have a whole collection of classes that apply.
That's cool.
ID, like you said, the hash sign. We also have an attribute selector, meaning find me an element that has an attribute that is this attribute, or find me an element that has an attribute with this value, or whatever. And we're not going to cover that in too much depth, but you use the square braces. So when you see the square braces, that's what's happening. There's also these things called pseudo-class selectors and pseudo-element selectors. The pseudo-class uses a single colon, and the pseudo-element uses the double colon. These are super handy because where a beginner will go and sprinkle classes around in his HTML and then refer to them with class elements, a pro will know that I don't have to go do that explicitly because that already exists as a pseudo-class. It's kind of free. It's kind of already there for me. All right, hopefully this will become more concrete as I show you examples. Let's give it a try. So we just looked at selectors. Now let's look at combinators because, again, in our example down here, you see that we've got a space in between these two simple selectors that make up this the style rules selector. And in this case, this space is a descendant combinator. That's what it means. It means descendant. And that makes sense because what I'm saying is find me anything that has a descendant. I don't care how deep, I don't care how far down the DOM tree it is, it has a descendant that is of a certain type. So if I said, for instance, div space, now this space here is important. I'll put a little symbol there to indicate that there's a space there. Div space dot many. What this means is find me an element with a class of many that has as what's the opposite of a descendant? An ancestor. It has as an ancestor a div. So it's pretty general. It means inside of a div, there's something with a class of many. Right. So this becomes really important for kind of namespacing in your CSS because you're able to say, okay, I'll put all of my stuff in a class called myStuff. And now when you say my.myStuff space dot many, you're saying only find the dot manys that are inside of this namespace, all right? So that's very important. You'll run into that one a lot. But do know that the child combinator is also available, and that means that it has to be a direct child. So if I say div child combinator and then dot many, What that means is find me an element with a class of many that has as its immediate parent a div. So that's a bit different.
No grandchildren allowed here.
Yeah, no, this is not, anywhere up the tree. This is my dad is a div.
That's right.
Yeah, you can quote me on that.
I will.
So there are a couple of other combinators, and you really don't see the child combinator all that often, and you see the sibling combinators even less often. Sometimes they can be really useful, though. If you're looking for something that is a sibling of something else, you can use either the general or the adjacent sibling combinators. See, this is kind of stuff that you don't necessarily see in a CSS 101 course, but if this is what you're trying to do, then it's perfect. You're really glad to have it. What this means is that if I have a div, I call it a squiggly, it's actually a tilde, and you probably have different names for it. We have people online, attendees online today from all around the world. You guys probably have different names for that. I'll call it a squiggly for these purposes.
Okay.
And if I say div.many, then what I'm saying here is find me an element with a class of many that is the sibling to an element of type div. Now, if instead of a general sibling combinator, I use the plus, which is the adjacent sibling combinator, it means the element that came directly before me has to be a div. So they're pretty specific, and I think that's why you don't see them quite as often. All right, those are selectors and combinators. Anything to add there?
No, that was fantastic.
Okay. Now, everybody's used a word processor. And in a word processor, day one, when you were 9 years old, you used a word processor, you discovered that you can select things and then format them, right? You can select a word and hit the bold B at the top of your screen, and it turns bold. What you're doing is you're selecting and then affecting, okay? You're selecting a certain part of your document, just this word, just this paragraph, everything, whatever you want, and then you're affecting it. You're hitting the bold button, you're hitting the center button, or whatever. It's the same thing with CSS, just have that in mind. The selector and these combinations of selectors and the combinators, all that's doing is saying, I'm trying to specify which part of my DOM I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the first word in the second paragraph with a class of whatever inside a div. Okay, so that's all selection. And then the list of things that show up in that style rule, that's the effect. That's what you want to do to the thing that you've selected. So this is the select, and this is the effect. Okay? Now there are hundreds of these style properties in CSS. Actually, the easiest way to get a handle on which ones are available to you are if you simply open in any CSS document and you go into any style rule in Visual Studio and you hit Control Space. In case you didn't know, that's the keyboard shortcut for, hey, IntelliSense, show me what I can do here. And then you just start scrolling. And you scroll, and you scroll, and all the ones at the front are these vendor specific, so that looks a little funny, but most of them are the normal ones that are not vendor prefixed. And you scroll, and you scroll, and you scroll, and you scroll, and then tomorrow you're done going through this list of hundreds of CSS properties. So one interesting thing about CSS properties is that they're all flat. All of these can apply to any element, and it may or may not be meaningful at all. You could say I want to center the text on my image, and it'll just say, I'm just going to ignore you because that doesn't really mean anything to me. So you as the developer have to know what properties are meaningful for what elements, even though you can apply anything to anything. And ultimately, it's this, well, the spec defines what these are supposed to do to the elements, but ultimately it's the browser that defines it, right? Code is king. Whatever they wrote, where they wrote your browser, that's what determines what effect these things have. So you'll find nuances between the various browsers. You'll find that different things, they just work differently. You've got to test it. You've got to test it in all the browsers. That's one of the reasons why you want to go to modern.ie, hit your website, and figure out what this sucker is going to look like in a really small screen using Chrome versus in a gigantic screen using Safari versus as a Windows 8 app, whatever, everywhere. Test, test, test. Okay, so those are the concepts. Now let's look at a code pen, okay?
Cool.
I'm going to take you back out to my code pens here. You can go to codepen.io/codefoster, and one of the ones that you'll see is this clove hitch. And really, this is just, this is about a knot. I like knots, and this is some information that I pulled from the web about the clove hitch, but the reason why it exists like this is because there's this big structure about it. And so we can use this structure. I can write some CSS here and I can target it. Now, Michael already showed you the basics, how you can say things like, I want to target all divs and I want to color them red. I do that, and now everything inside of a div in my results shows up red. Notice the following links should help you find related content. Did not show up red. I don't know who chose violet on my screen for my drawing, but we're just going to have to roll with that because that's what it is. Oops. So it did not show up because if I look at my DOM, that's not in a div. It's in a section. Okay? It's in a section, so it's not, I'm not meaning to zoom there. And so it's not showing up red. And now I have no choice. That's just selecting it by type. Now let me look in here and see if I have anything that has a class. Here we go. Here's a class of intro. So let me in my CSS say intro. And once again, this is the same as star.intro, but we don't need that. We can assume that. And now this is saying, okay, only that one paragraph is going to show up red. Versus ID, and down lower I have an ID of links, so I can say links, and now only those links are, only the stuff in the section with an ID of links are showing up red. So those are the things that you showed. Type, ID, and class, extremely important. Let's get into some depth. Let's say I only want to make those LIs stand out as red, not the paragraph that says the following links should help you find related content, okay? So I can just say links, but what I'm actually interested in is the LIs that are inside of those links. So I'll put a space, and it'll say LI. Now the paragraph itself is not red, the LIs are. The list items are red. So I've gotten more specific.
Yeah, and what's really nice about that too is that's an example of how the LI is truly a descendant. It's not a direct child of the links because the links was in an outer, I don't remember if it was a section or a div, but then there was the ordered list tag that appeared and then the link. So that was a good example of that.
Yeah, yeah, and in fact, if I go into here and I put a child combinator, you notice that the red goes away. Because now it's looking for an LI, which is a direct child, a direct descendant of a section, and that doesn't exist. Now, if I got more specific and said, I'm looking for a section which has an OL, which has an LI, notice that it's finding 4 of those, and it's applying that style to all 4 of those. So these composite selectors that are made up of multiple simple selectors are really powerful, and you'll see them in any significantly sized web project or app made with HTML and JavaScript in Windows. Because when you get a sizable project, you really need to get into namespacing and being specific about what you reference.
And one thing I'd comment on there too that I think is important is you could open that document and see there was only one area where LIs were. So you could just rationalize that you could just put LI there. Unless I'm wrong about that.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So if there's only one area where they are, you could have just said, I'll just put LI in the CSS. But the benefit of doing it the way that Jeremy just showed, which was actually having a path down to it, is it actually is an assistant to the CSS processor, meaning it can understand and say, oh, this is how I get to that. So it doesn't have to go through everything. You've actually given it a more direct path. So it's actually a good tip to use as direct of a path as possible when you can so that you can get the benefit of that.
Yeah, the benefit from a performance standpoint, and also the fact that if I just apply the style to LIs, that's going to apply to any LIs that are used in my entire project, because there's not really any namespacing in CSS besides these composite selectors. So let's have a look at some of the combinators. Well, we looked at some of the combinators. Let's have a look at some of the other features of CSS. So I wanted to show you, what was the next one that I wanted to show you? Let's say I want to use a pseudo class. Here I have a div that has a couple of paragraphs in it, right? It's got a class of main text, and it's got a couple of paragraphs in it. So I'm going to say main text. Everything's red in the main text paragraph. There we go. But I'm only interested in the paragraphs inside, so I could get more specific and say just the paragraphs. the effect actually looks the same. But now I could tack on a pseudo class. Remember, that uses a single semicolon for the symbol there. And I can say I'm only interested in the first child. So now it's saying find the paragraph that is also a first child. I didn't have to go decorate my paragraph with a class that says first. That's a pseudo class, so it's available to me. And there are a lot of these pseudo classes, and some of them are pretty fancy. Let me say nth child 2, and now I've specified the second paragraph explicitly. I can also say, how about nth child odd? And now I'm selecting the first and third and fifth and seventh. You see that would work really well for doing every other, you know?
Sure.
And there are a lot of those pseudo selectors. When you get into the pseudo elements and you're using the 2 colons, that's just subtly different from the pseudo classes, and we're not going to actually dive into it, but that's what that is. All right, so this is going to enable you to target just exactly what you want in your DOM and style it with exactly what you want. And it's really nice that these two things are separated. It's a separation of concerns. We have what Michael called our source, or sometimes I call our structure, which is the HTML. And then we have our style, which is the CSS. And the fact that it's a completely different file is nice because it means that I can have a few different style sheets, and I can load one, or conditionally, maybe based on some user configuration, I can load a different one. And all of a sudden, the same exact HTML structure looks completely different. And likewise, I can say, as we're going to be visiting in our upcoming course starting tomorrow, I want to target both Windows, which is going to have a screen like this, and Windows Phone, which is going to have a screen like this. I can use the same HTML structure, and then I can have one style sheet that makes it look like a desktop. It makes it look like a large screen. I can have another style sheet that takes into account the fact that it's going to be showing up on a phone. Okay, so that's a demo of the selectors and the combinators. I'm going to mention the directives. The directives are kind of at a different level. When you're writing CSS, I said that it's a large collection of style rules, and in fact it is, but there are also these things called directives that rules can show up in. For instance, if you're using the media directive. And the ones that I'm going to mention are font face, media, and keyframes. Michael's going to go much more into keyframes, so I'm only going to mention it. That's for animations. Font face is really helpful. It's going to allow you to bring in custom fonts. So I'll use this as an example. Here's a font face directive. And it's by spec, it's requiring that I have a font family name, and this is just something I make up, so I could call this Charlie if I want. I can call it whatever I want, as long as that's what I use whenever I reference this font. Then the important part is this reference to a font file. So in this case, I'm pointing to a TTF file, and you can point to a variety of font formats, OTF, TTF, lots of them, and including the web font format, which has got some modern advantages using the web font format. But the TTF works just fine, and a lot of times when you have your collection of fonts, you might have TTF, so we can use that. Now, anywhere in my app now, like let's say in this color bar, if I wanted this to use that 39 smooth font, I would be able to say font family, and then I just use that same name that I chose, and it's going to use that font file. This is super nice because this means the user doesn't have to have 39 smooth on their machine. Although, I mean, classically, we had to guess, what are they going to have? What are they going to have? Maybe Helvetica, maybe Arial, maybe Times New Roman. I'm going to be able to use those. But if I want to use 39 smooth because I think it looks cool, what did I do? I made an image out of it, right? Images are no good. You can't search them. You can't make them available via accessibility as easily. So it's really great being able to put things in their native font and include that font with your package. Do keep in mind that this font file is being downloaded by the user agent. So if I'm hitting this in my browser, it's doing a separate request, just like if you have images or video. It's doing a separate request to pull down that font file and can kind of install it so that the user can use it. And so there are some tricks that you can use. We won't take the time right now, but there's some tricks that you can use to making a small character set so that you're not pulling down that entire font file for everybody every time. Now media will allow you to specify different ranges that have different parameters, and then the device is going to load those different ranges of CSS style rules in different conditions. Let me give you an example. I've got a phone and I've got a laptop. On the laptop, I'm going to probably have a screen that has a higher resolution, and so I can create a media directive. We call them a media query that says, what's the width of my screen? And then it's able to specify CSS style rules that target that screen width, or maybe everything above 1,000 pixels wide and everything below 1,000 pixels wide. Media queries are super handy in this day and age when we have to make our sites responsive. They have to be adaptive to the screen that they're running on in order for people to be able to see them with a good user experience on their phone on the bus and also on their work computer with a giant 30-inch monitor. Okay? Let's do a demo here. Let's look at font face. This is actually in CodeShow. So if you have the CodeShow app, you can just go look at this. I'll open CodeShow. And in CodeShow, you can just start typing. So I'm just going to start typing the word font. I actually want to make it so that I can just start typing from wherever I'm at in CodeShow. Unfortunately, right now, you have to be back at the hub screen, but I'm going to fix that. So I just start typing. I type font, and it does a search for all of my demos that include the word font, either in the title or as a keyword. So I've got font properties and font face. In fact, it's font face that I want to show you. So I chose a couple of fun font faces here. What you can see in my HTML, once again, we're violet. That's not my favorite color, by the way. You can see in my HTML that I have a couple of divs, and they have classes that are on them. And the first class is states, and the second class is good dog. All right. Now this is what I was talking about, where the demo is showing, but also the code is showing in CodeShow. You might guess that's where we got the name of the app.
I guessed that.
Yeah, you guessed that. So here you can see the HTML, here you can see the CSS, and in fact this demo doesn't require any JavaScript, so there's just not a JavaScript file there. But you can see that for anything with a font face element that has a descendant that has a class of states, I want to apply these CSS styles. The first of which is I want this to be the GeoBats font family. Well, GeoBats is not defined on their system automatically, or by default. We had to define that down here. So this is included with the package. This is the folder that it's in, and I chose to call it GeoBats. And then this has to match this, and it's going to work. And in fact, we already saw that it does work. That's good. So that brings in the GeoBats font, and now all of a sudden I'm typing ABCD and I'm getting countries. This is awesome. We love graphic fonts, right? So that's the font face demo. I've got another demo for you for media queries. So let's go back to the hub and type media. You'll find the media queries demo. We'll jump into it. And voila, it's another knot. Sorry, I love knots. This is the bowline knot. If you don't know it, you probably should learn it. It's a really important one. And the media queries is going to show you how we want this to be able to work in various screen sizes. Now, I'm not going to take the time to open the simulator, but you can imagine that what I want to happen here is if this CodeShow instance is running on a machine with a wide enough screen, then I want it to appear exactly like this, with the knot on the left and the paragraph on the right. But if this is showing up in a narrow browser, like maybe it's showing up on the phone, then I want the paragraph to show up underneath. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in my style sheet, in my CSS file, I'm going to specify a media query here. Now notice I only have the one, so what this means is that all of these style rules should apply automatically. And then, in addition to that, if we have a max width of 700 pixels, so in other words, if the screen that our app is running in is currently 700 pixels wide or narrower, then I want to change the flex direction. If you haven't seen this yet, don't worry, we're going to get to this soon. I want to change the flex direction to column so everything's going to show up vertically. Okay? So it completely changes the layout, and our HTML, that's not what I intended, our HTML does not have to change. So our HTML here is simply a image tag and a div tag with the paragraph, and I don't have to change that. I just lay it out differently depending on the browser. Okay, so one more, I'm going to show you CSS border. CSS, actually I've got a couple more, but I think I might skip some of them in the interest of time. So the CSS border will show you how you can set various borders. That's what some of those style properties that you can set. There's also a border radius. This is nice. This came in CSS 3. We didn't have this before. We had various methods of trickery, of course, to try to work around it. But now it's really just as easy as doing something like border radius 5 pixels or border radius 40 pixels, and you're good to go. Okay, I'll show gradients. We'll go ahead and show gradients, right? So in my app, gradients, there it is. Let's jump into it. I can do gradients like this natively with the web stack using CSS. And again, it's not difficult. This is not rocket science. Of course, it shouldn't be. I'm just doing these background properties and setting a linear gradient left, dark gray to white. And that gives me a gradient from gray to white here from the left-hand side. All right, those are gradients. Okay, we've taken quite a bit of time on the basic syntax of CSS, but I really need to show you some layout strategies. This is a very modern concept. It used to be, not that it's extremely new, but this is a critical concept for you to know when you're working in modern apps. You really need to know modern layout techniques. Some of the old layout techniques, although they're still supported, they are painful, and if anybody sees your source, you will be the ridicule of the web community. So, not really. Shouldn't be so harsh. What we're talking about here is layout. We're talking about putting things in the right place, okay? So I've just brought up the Microsoft.com website here, and you notice some things that, well, maybe you don't notice because the web is so familiar to us that we just don't even notice it anymore, but notice that I've got a bit of a margin on the left here. I've got some space that's pushing everything away over from the left. That's important. I've got a nav bar here that has things laid out horizontally with some space in between. I've got an image that's taking up this center section, but whether that image is in fact this entire section or whether it's just a little piece of this and the spacing is being controlled by CSS here on the edges and below it, I don't really know. I don't really care. I just want it to have this look. Maybe my designer drew this up for me and I want it to look like this. Down lower on the page, I've got some tiles that are rendering for me, and I want those to have some spacing in between them. These are the concepts that we're talking about here. These are layout concepts, and so I want to walk you through a few layout strategies. The first few I'm just going to mention, and then we're going to have a moment of silence and celebration of the fact that we don't have to put up with these old layout strategies anymore. And those are things like flow, table. Sometimes absolute is still useful, and certainly float. These older layout strategies, flow is actually still one that you'll end up using just because that's the way text works. But these older layout strategies are still around, they still work, but there are pains that are inherent in them that are the reason why these newer layout strategies are invented. So I actually have a demo in CodeShow. Not the IDs and classes one. I'm going to show you one called Layouts. And the layout demo shows you a few of these different layout strategies. Now I want you to look in the first demo here for this wonderful throwback image to Microsoft Bob. I want this image to show up in line with the text. I want it to kind of flow with my text. And so when I include that Bob image, you can see that right here. When I include that Bob image right in line with my text, it just flows. That's the way it works. That's like the default layout strategy in HTML, okay? But if I want to get more prescriptive with my layout, then I can use one of the various layout techniques. The first of which I'm mentioning but not recommending, is table layout. So I've got a table that's laid out here, and you can see that because I'm able to determine the size of these layout cells, that I can use a table not only for tables, tables of figures, scientific figures and things like that, but I can use a table for layout. I can say, I want I want to make sure that this is over on the right side of the screen or the left side of the screen. And there's a lot of problems with doing this, one of which is the fact that you're bringing your style and layout out of CSS into your HTML. Your HTML is, you no longer have a good separation of concerns. Your HTML is not merely the structure, it's now the structure with kind of the style built into it, and that'll bite you for sure. That's a problem. So another strategy is absolute or relative positioning, and you can see that in this sentence I've got the word bump, and bump is bumped up about 5 pixels. And if I hold down absolute, you can see that it takes it out entirely. And as a matter of fact, the text even reflows so that bump is not in the flow of the text of that paragraph. This is absolute and relative positioning, and it's still helpful as a way of specifying that you want things to kind of go over here or go over there, or if you know your set screen size and you know that you want something to appear in one part of the screen, you can use absolute positioning to say always put it there. But if you're trying to lay your entire site or app out using absolute or relative positioning, you're going to run into trouble because you don't know what size screen people are going to be visiting your app with. Okay, so be careful with that one. The next one is float. Float is a way of kind of allowing things to land next to each other. So it's an ability to lay things out horizontally. See these divs that we're looking at here. Divs normally lay out one above the other, and here we want them to land next to each other. So we're specifying float. Let me run over here to the CSS. We're specifying the type of float and saying float left. And float left puts those next to each other. This is a painful way to do it, actually, and the better way is the next one, flexbox. As you can see, it achieves the exact same thing, but this is what it was made for. It was made for laying things out like this. And I've got a couple demos on Flexbox and a couple demos on Grid. Grid is an interesting one. Grid is really powerful. It allows you, kind of like tables, to put things where you want them and to specify things like, I want this to always be 100 pixels wide, or more flexibly, I want this to take up whatever space is remaining. Relative, you can control the children inside the grid, and the children are not contained explicitly by the cells of the grid. So you can put it in the second column, but then you can use margin to kind of bump it over into the first column by a little bit. So grids are really powerful, but it's a standard that isn't as far along as Flexboxes. So if you're trying to do cross-browser, I would say start with Flexbox because you're going to be able to hit all the browsers. If you know you're making a Windows app and that your target browser engine is going to be IE, then you can go ahead and use Grid if that really helps you out. So demos in CodeShow for Flexbox and Grid. The best way to get to those are to search for the word Flex. You'll find a bunch of Flexbox demos. Just a simple one is just going to lay them out horizontally, and you're going to be able to look at the CSS that it takes to do that. Okay, very simple. But let's look at something a little bit differently, like vertical Flexboxes. How do you lay them out vertically? And in this case, I'm still using the MS prefixed versions, but the Flexbox has, since I wrote this, made it to more of a standard, so I need to update this and use the standard Flexbox attributes.
To do item noted.
To do item note, yeah, that's
Sure.
on the list. So we can also use Flexboxes to do some fancy things. Like here, I've used it to make something kind of like the flip view. It's like a swiper. I'm using some snap points, and I'm recognizing the gesture. And again, that's just done in the CSS like the others.
And I know that you're going through a lot of those, but I think it's really important for everyone to know that those new standards are making life so easy. The fact that they all fit on just a single page for viewing is just a masterpiece in itself. To do some of these things took so much work in the past, and so the benefit of getting into the modern web platform now is that you do get to, hop on that bandwagon where everything has already been kind of done the hard way, and now it's getting so much simpler so that we can do these kind of layout strategies.
Yeah. Let's take a look at my screen real quick. I've jumped out to a browser, and I'm showing you caniuse.com. If you haven't used this, you can use it, by the way. If you're wondering if you can use it, yeah, you can use Can I Use.
I get it.
And I'm going to look for Flex on this page, and you'll see that there's a section about the flexible box layout module, and you'll get to look at the browser support for it. So Flexbox is rocking it. Looks like we've got everything but Opera Mini supporting Flexbox at this point. That's really good. So if you go look at grid, it's not quite so beautiful a picture. You've got quite a bit of red on there. We basically implemented this for IE so that we could have some parity with XAML, but don't have as much support in there. I know some of the other browsers have it in experimental mode, but that's the state of things. Okay, let's jump over to a search for grid in CodeShow. And this is going to show you everything from kind of a simple grid. Here's just 4 cells and how to determine where the children lay out in this very, very simple grid. All the way up to some fancier grids like this grid that has some row spans on it, and the fancy CSS grid that you can see I'm kind of implementing a bit of a tile interface for. And then one where I use some JavaScript. Where is that one? Big Colorful Grid. Big Colorful Grid uses some JavaScript to go and create a gigantic grid with a lot of columns and a lot of rows, and then color each of them a random color. So, well, just so that it can be pretty, basically. That's the bottom line there. Okay, wow, we're covering a lot of ground here, and we're almost out of time. I want to play a little game. We've got a few minutes remaining. I want to play a little game here, and it's called Implement This Layout.
Okay.
I did this in a previous MVA, and it was a lot of fun. And what I want to do is I want to show you kind of a comp, kind of like what your designer might bring you, a concept of this is how I want this site or this app to be laid out. And then I want you to put your developer hat on and say, how would I implement this layout? What layout features would I use in order to make this happen? So let's start with a really simple one.
Okay.
I'll ask you, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Michael. How would you implement this layout?
Well, going back to the old days, I could imagine that, if I were mixing up source with style, that could have been an HTML table. Mm-hmm. But if I'm trying to do it the new way, I might guess, especially if it's IE, maybe a grid.
Okay, cool. Yeah, the grid would certainly work. If you're making a Windows app and you know that you don't need to have cross-browser support, you're free to use the grid. That would be a really good way to do this. You could actually use nested flex boxes to do this as well. You could have a vertical flex box of 2 elements, each of which is a flex box with a horizontal layout of 2 elements, and that would work. Flex boxes are really good at saying I want to take up exactly half my space and things like that.
It sounded like a Dr. Seuss book when you were saying that. So
you could use a flex box with some rocks and the fox.
Yes, exactly.
You could also use a flexbox with wrapping. One of the things I didn't mention explicitly was that flexboxes are capable of wrapping. So you could have a flexbox with 4 items, excuse me here, laid out horizontally, but flexing so that wrapping rather, so that they go down to the next column. Okay, once again, you're on the spot, Palermo
right.
4. I'm sorry, this was a example implementation of that, but we'll move right on to the next one. How would you implement this? This might be a Twitter feed. It might be, who knows?
Sure. So again, and I say this especially for those who may have HTML but not the modern HTML, as we're talking about. They may look at this as a table with 1 column and many rows. But then in the modern web world, instead of trying to overcomplicate things, that could just be a whole bunch of divs.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's my default implementation here. It's really just 5 divs. And I want to prescribe their height and give them a little bit of margin. And yeah, I've got that layout. Now, if I wanted to control the distribution of these, for instance, if I wanted to say I want this to take up the whole page, and I always want them to be equally spaced, then I would use a flex box, because flex boxes are able to say, for each of their items, I want you to flex and take up this amount of space, but no more than this, and I want you to be evenly distributed. Really good for things like that. All right, Palermo 4, you're on.
The flex thing.
That's going to be your default answer now, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and the grid would work too. If you can target IE, if you know you're making an app, the grid would work. But yeah, the flex would work for that. You could do a wrapping flex box, but I wouldn't recommend it. I would recommend a flex header with a couple of elements, and then a flex for the body. All right, here's another one.
I still say flex.
Flex box for this one for sure. This is a horizontal layout. It looks like probably when the screen scales, when not necessarily scales but resizes, that I want these to remain taking up a third each of the screen. Now, if I'm showing this on a phone, then if I'm showing it in a portrait layout, then this might get kind of weird, and I might want to use a media query to say, no, stack these vertically whenever I'm showing in portrait mode. Whenever I'm showing in landscape mode like you see now, I want these to be horizontally laid out. And that's just so simple, because in your media query, you change the flexbox layout direction, and you're done. It completely changes the orientation there. Wow, here you go.
Grid and flex.
Yeah, grid would work. It'd be pretty prescriptive. Flex would work. You'd really have to figure out, do you want this to be like top down and items go to the right, or read it from left to right and the items go top down? Because you can see that these are kind of cut off on the right. You know, these ones are smaller than the rest of them. We've got a boundary that's happening here. Those should actually hit the edge of the screen in order to lead the user off the screen, but they're not. So probably what we want here is for the direction to be something like this, like that, all right? So we want these to be laid out N. Have you heard of N layout, Z layout? N layout, because this looks roughly like an N. Actually, more like a, there's a Cyrillic character for that, I know. Sure. Versus a Z layout, where I want these to go this direction and then wrap down to the next line. You can see that that looks like a Z. But you know what? I've got something else going on here. I've got this header up here. How would I do that? Well, I might want to have for myself overall a vertical flex layout that contains this item in the first element, and then another big container that contains all of this as the second element. And those are laid out vertically. Okay? But then nested inside of this flexbox item, I want to have another flex container that now is wrapping and so on. So that's how that works. And let's see if we've got one more. There it is. What do you think?
Ooh, it could just be some divs inside of something that is being flexed to a certain direction.
Yeah, or gridded. Yeah, you could same type of thing. You could grid the overall thing, and then you could just use divs on the left. You'll find if you dig into the Flexbox that there are a few things that it gives you that I would actually probably choose a Flexbox over just a stack of divs in most cases because of some of the power that it gives you. So, okay, well, I had a couple more, but we're going to go ahead and call that good. Some resources I wanted to give you before we summarize and close out of this module. First of all, I mentioned my book. There's the link. I love CSS-tricks.com. It's actually affiliated with CodePen.io. A lot of really good information there. So if you want to dig into dive into the depths of CSS, go to css-tricks.com. I also found this one, htmldog.com, which is cool. A lot of good training if you're, especially like beginner training in the stack. And then, as I mentioned, codepen.io, there's my pen. There's where all my pens are published in case I have any there that are helpful for you. So we looked at the Dev Center, we looked at CSS syntax, some layout strategies, and then we played a brilliant game called Implement This Layout.
Which he told me nothing about before, so I truly was guessing.
Oh, yeah, that was a complete surprise for Michael. But it was easy, right? Because the answer to every question was flex.
True. I could get away with that.
Yeah. You could get away with that. All right, is there anything else you want to tack on before we close?
No.
All right, well, that's it for this module. We are going to be coming back. We're going to be taking a 10-minute break before the next module. You'll definitely want to join us for that.